In my Sunshine State of Mind painting series, I've used the grid method with reference images quite a lot in a few paintings. Today I thought I would show you how I construct my grid, the tools I use, and how I use it. If you're not super confident in your drawing abilities, or if you want a very detailed sketch, the grid method is really the way to go. I'll show you two types of grids today. The first one is a more precise grid. There's a few steps, not complicated at all. There's just a few steps to follow. And the second one is super fast. It's kind of like a slapdash, quick and easy way to do it. It's a little less precise, but it's very useful in many situations. The very first thing to figure out is knowing what exact size you need your artwork to be on, as in the final product, your canvas size, if it's a painting, or your drawing size, you need the exact size of that. And once I know that, I could first work on creating the grid on my reference image. For that, I need the computer. To do this, I'll be using Photoshop, but if you don't know Photoshop or you don't have it, you can use a program called GIMP. You can get it for free. It's just like Photoshop. It's really good to know the very basics of Photoshop or GIMP, not necessarily all the little details of it, but just how to crop an image, change the colors, levels, and contrast. Just the very basic stuff. It's a very useful tool to have. The very first thing I do is to drop my image directly on Photoshop or GIMP. Then I'm going to crop it in the same ratio as my final artwork. This is the crop tool here, and I have to input up here the size I want it to be. So unconstrained means that I could move this box any kind of proportions I want or ratio I want. And once I put in values, let's say my canvas is a 16 by 20, then that's the ratio I'll be able to work with. So I could focus on one detail of the photo, or I could try to get as much as the photo as I can. Let's say I want it to be like this. Once I'm done, I press on the check mark here and my photo's cropped. Here I would save a version of this photo, saving it as a JPEG. What I personally like to do as well is to create a black and white version of my image, just because sometimes the colors are distracting. Typically the black and white, I tend to have it very highly contrasted. To tweak the colors, the main tools that I use are hue and saturation, to desaturate or saturate my image, and levels. So I push the white, push the black. The next tool that I use is this tool by arttutor.com. It's their grid drawing tool. The link will be in the description box. The first step is to upload the photo that I just prepared. I'll use the black and white version for you to see better. I go next. Steps 2, 3, and 4 are there for you if you need to, but I've already done all that in Photoshop. I feel like it's more precise. I go straight to step 5, where I create my grid. And this is where I decide how many boxes I want. Since I know that my canvas is 20 by 16, so boxes wide, I will put a square per inch, so I'll need 20 squares. I can decide the color of my grid. I'll keep it red. I can also decide the thickness of the lines, and I apply the grid. And now I just download this image, and here it is. I can work digitally on a tablet or on my phone, or I can print this with the grid on. I've decided to print a version of it just for you to see better. If I print my image, I would probably number the rows and columns just as a quick reference guide. You'll see what I mean next. And from here, you have two choices. The first choice is to take your canvas or your final format drawing, your paper, and to reproduce a grid on there. Basically drawing squares that are 1 by 1 on the entire canvas. Or, which is what I do, I take a piece of paper, the exact size of my canvas, and I draw my grid on that piece of paper, because I will sketch on a piece of paper first And then once my sketch is exactly how I want it to be, I will transfer that sketch onto my final surface, like my final canvas. Side note, in my next video, I'll show you how I transfer my sketch onto my canvas. If you don't want to miss it, you can turn on notification. Just saying. It's an extra step. Not everybody might want to do this, but the reason I do it is because I want to be able to have a neater sketch at the end without having erased or having my lines too bold or messy. And also because if I didn't have a separate sketch and I painted over my sketch on the canvas, and let's say I messed up, if I wanted to start over a certain area of the painting, I would have to kind of freehand the sketch. Whereas now I have my sketch separately and I could retransfer that area onto my canvas. It's kind of like a safety net, but also if I want to redo the painting at some point with different colors, I just like to preserve a copy of my sketch. And for that, I don't mind the extra step of having to transfer my sketch once it's done. Question of personal taste. Obviously, if you don't print your reference image, you won't have the reference numbers to reference which square you're at. You can always do that in Photoshop if you want to take the time to number each little squares and lines. Once you have your reference image with the grid and your final format of drawing our canvas with the grid, you're ready to start sketching. From there, it's very easy. You just follow the lines, you reference what square matches your reference image, and you just follow the lines, you follow through. It might seem complicated if you've never used it, but it's a really useful tool, and once you get into it, it just flows. With more experience, with more skills, those types of grids are not necessarily useful unless you do something hyper realistic, but depending on my mood, I find myself using them. If I want something very figurative and I want more precision, or I don't want to have the stress of feeling like I'm sketching without a net, because that's kind of like training wheels for sketching in a way. And that's the first grid. All right, now I'll show you how to do the super easy, fast slapdash second type of grid. For that grid, you still need to know what your final format will be before starting, and you need to edit your reference image to be that exact same ratio or proportion. So a 16 by 20 canvas could be a 4 by 5 photo because it's the same ratio. If it's not, the image will be all distorted. Could be interesting, but it wouldn't be accurate. Once I have that, I print my reference image because I'll draw the grid directly on the reference image, as well as my sketch, same kind of principle. And for that, there's no measurements involved. It's just a big X across the page. Over that X, I put a cross. And then in each of the 4 sections created, I will do the same. I will make sure there's an X and a cross. So a big X and a cross, and then there's 4 sections remaining, and I turn those into a big X and a cross. So instead of squares, it's a bunch of triangles. There's no numbers to reference them, but as I follow my sketch, it's pretty easy to make sure that I'm in the right triangle. And if not, if I'm not sure, I just kind of count. And I tend to work by section, so I'll use like a quarter of my sketch to start with, and I'll work that in and then move on to the next. So it's kind of easy to follow through. I like that method because it doesn't involve too many steps. But when I have a reference image that is more complicated, or if I want to put in more details, I find that the smaller squares are more precise and easier to reference. Here's an example of me using the easy grid with the triangles. And you see those colors? I used erasable colored pencils for those sections. It's basically kind of fixing mistakes. Instead of erasing or over erasing, I went over with a different color to see where the lines that I wanted to keep were. As you can see, I'm kind of messy with my sketches. I tend to use grids mainly when I do portraits because I love doing portraits, but they're a little bit more tricky. To get a proper likeness, you need to get the lines right. It might seem like there's a lot of steps and it might seem a bit complicated, but You should really try it because once you really do it, you'll see that it's really easy and so useful. I still have maybe 3 or 4 sketches to do in my Sunshine State of Mind series before I have all the paintings that I currently wanted to have finalized this year. Then I get going and start working on them. If you want more inspiration, you can watch this one next. I'll be back very soon for another one. Bye.